June 6, 1944, Omaha Beach, Normandy. Private First Class Robert Capa, the famous combat photographer, waded through the surf beside a waterproof jeep struggling to reach the beach. German machine gun fire stitched the water around him. Men were falling, drowning in the chaos of the landing. Yet the jeep drivers kept their vehicles moving forward, engines coughing and sputtering as seawater threatened to flood the intakes. Within hours, jeeps were racing up the draws from the beach, carrying ammunition to units pinned down by German fire. They evacuated wounded men back to the beach aid stations. They towed anti-tank guns into position. They served as command vehicles for officers coordinating the battle. By nightfall, dozens of jeeps were operating across the precarious beachhead, performing missions their designers had never imagined. The jeep wasn't supposed to be there. It wasn't designed for amphibious landings. It wasn't armored. It carried no meaningful weaponry. Yet it became indispensable precisely because it could do everything else. In June 1940, as France fell and Britain fought alone against Nazi Germany, the U.S. Army recognized it would need a light reconnaissance vehicle if America entered the war. The specification the Army issued seemed almost impossible to fulfill. A quarter-ton, 500-pound payload, four-wheel drive, low silhouette, capable of traveling cross-country, simple enough for any soldier to maintain, and light enough to be manhandled when stuck. The weight specification was particularly challenging. A quarter-ton payload meant the vehicle itself could weigh no more than about 1,300 pounds to stay within the total weight limit of 2,000 pounds including payload. That weight limit would make the vehicle light enough to be transported by air or loaded quickly onto ships. But designing a four-wheel drive vehicle with that weight was extraordinarily difficult with 1940 technology. The Army solicited bids from 135 companies. Only 3 responded: American Bantam Car Company, Willys Overland Motors, and Ford Motor Company. The Army was asking for a complete prototype in just 49 days, an impossible timeline by normal automotive industry standards. The companies that didn't respond weren't being cowardly. They were being realistic about what could be designed and built in that time frame. American Bantam was a small company in Butler, Pennsylvania, that had been producing small economy cars with limited success. They were desperate for a contract and willing to try something other companies considered impossible. Bantam assigned their chief engineer, Karl Probst, to design the vehicle. Probst worked essentially around the clock for days, creating a design that met the Army's specifications by ruthlessly eliminating anything that wasn't essential. The Bantam prototype, completed in just 49 days as required, weighed 1,840 pounds over the Army's specification, but close enough to prove the concept was feasible. The vehicle performed remarkably well in Army tests at Camp Holabird, Maryland. It could climb steep grades, traverse rough terrain, and maintain surprising speeds on roads. The Army was impressed but concerned about Bantam's limited production capacity. Willys Overland submitted their prototype, the Quad, in November 1940. It exceeded the weight specification significantly, coming in at 2,450 pounds. But it had a more powerful engine, the Go Devil 4-cylinder, producing 60 horsepower compared to Bantam's 45 horsepower. The additional power made the vehicle more capable, even if it was heavier. Willys engineer Barney Roos had created a robust design that could handle punishment. Ford's entry, the Pick-Me, arrived in November 1940 as well. Ford brought massive manufacturing capability, but their prototype was less refined than the Willys design. Ford's experience with mass production would become crucial. But initially their vehicle wasn't as impressive mechanically as the Willys or as innovative as the Bantam. The Army found itself with 3 different designs, each with strengths and weaknesses. Rather than selecting one, they ordered 1,500 vehicles from each manufacturer for field testing. This decision was controversial. It seemed inefficient to have 3 different vehicles when standardization would simplify logistics. But the Army wanted extensive field testing before committing to mass production. The field tests revealed that soldiers loved the little vehicles. They were incredibly useful for reconnaissance, communication, and light transport. The 4-wheel drive allowed them to go almost anywhere. The simplicity meant that soldiers with basic mechanical knowledge could maintain them. The versatility meant they were constantly finding new uses the Army hadn't anticipated. The Army eventually standardized on the Willys design as the basis for production, recognizing it as the best balance of capability and producibility. but elements from all three designs influenced the final specification. The vehicle that emerged was a synthesis of innovations from Bantam, Willys and Ford, refined through extensive testing and soldier feedback. The production contract was split between Willys and Ford, with both companies manufacturing to the standardized design. Willys produced the MB model, Ford produced the GPW Government P for 80-inch wheelbase, Willys design. The two were virtually identical and interchangeable. This dual sourcing ensured production capacity would be adequate for the enormous numbers the Army would need. The name Jeep has contested origins. Some claim it came from GP, general purpose, others that it came from Eugene the Jeep, a Popeye comic character that could go anywhere. The origin doesn't matter as much as the fact that the name stuck. Soldiers started calling the vehicles Jeeps, and the name became universal. It would eventually become so associated with the vehicle that Willys would trademark it post-war. The Jeep's genius was its simplicity. Every component was designed to be as simple as possible while still functioning adequately. The result was a vehicle that could be maintained by soldiers with minimal training and repaired with basic tools under field conditions. The engine was a flathead four-cylinder of 134 cubic inches producing 60 horsepower. By automotive standards of the 1940s, this was not an impressive engine. It wasn't powerful, wasn't sophisticated, wasn't innovative, but it was reliable, simple to maintain, and adequate for the Jeep's needs. The engine could run on low-grade fuel, tolerate poor maintenance, and keep operating under conditions that would destroy more complex engines. The transmission was a 3-speed manual with a 2-speed transfer case providing high and low range in both 2-wheel and 4-wheel drive. This gave the Jeep enormous versatility. In 2-wheel drive high range, it could cruise at respectable speeds on roads. In 4-wheel drive low range, it could climb steep grades and traverse obstacles that would stop other vehicles. The system was mechanical and simple, with no electronics to fail. The suspension used leaf springs front and rear, a proven design that was rugged and maintainable. The springs gave the Jeep remarkable articulation. The wheels could move independently enough to maintain traction over very rough terrain. The suspension travel wasn't as sophisticated as independent suspension systems, but it was far more durable and easier to repair in the field. The body was stamped steel, simple and functional. There were no curves for aesthetic purposes. Every surface was flat or simply curved, making the body easy to manufacture and repair. Body damage could be pounded out with a hammer. Holes could be patched with sheet metal and rivets. The body wasn't beautiful, but it was practical. The seats were minimal, a bench in front and rear seating for passengers or cargo. The seats provided basic comfort, but nothing more. Weight was always the enemy, and padding added weight without adding capability. Soldiers learned to bring cushions if they were going on long trips, but the basic Jeep seats were Spartan. The instrumentation was minimal. Speedometer, oil pressure gauge, ammeter, and temperature gauge. No unnecessary gauges or indicators. Everything a driver needed to monitor the vehicle's condition. Nothing extra. The dashboard was flat and simple, easily accessible for repairs. The electrical system was 6-volt, standard for the era, and kept as simple as possible. Minimal wiring, basic lighting, essential accessories. The simplicity meant fewer electrical failures and easier troubleshooting when problems occurred. Many Jeeps in combat had their electrical systems simplified even further, with non-essential items disconnected to reduce failure points. The fuel system consisted of a simple gravity feed tank in the rear, fuel lines, a mechanical fuel pump, and a carburetor. No fuel injection, no complex emissions controls, no electronic management. The carburetor could be adjusted with a screwdriver. The fuel pump could be rebuilt in the field. The entire system could be understood by anyone with basic mechanical knowledge. The cooling system was straightforward: a radiator, water pump, thermostat, and hoses. The radiator was positioned at the front where it would receive maximum airflow. The system was sized adequately for the engine's heat output, but not overbuilt. Cooling system failures were common in hot climates or during extended low-speed operation, but the failures were easily diagnosed and repaired. The 4-wheel drive system was purely mechanical, using a transfer case to send power to both front and rear axles. Engaging 4-wheel drive required stopping the vehicle and manually shifting the transfer case lever. There was no automatic engagement, no computer control, just a simple mechanical connection that either sent power to all 4 wheels or didn't. System was crude but essentially bulletproof. The steering system used a simple steering box with direct mechanical linkage to the front wheels. There was no power steering. The Jeep had to be muscled through turns, particularly at low speeds or on rough terrain. But the mechanical simplicity meant steering failures were rare and repairs were straightforward. Once the design was finalized, production ramped up at a pace that reflected American industrial capacity at its peak. Willys and Ford together would produce over 640,000 Jeeps during World War II, an average of over 13,000 per month for 4 years. This level of production required industrial organization at massive scale. The Willys plant in Toledo, Ohio, became the primary Jeep production facility. The plant operated multiple shifts, running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Workers came from all backgrounds, including many women who entered the industrial workforce for the first time during the war. The assembly lines moved continuously, with workers performing repetitive tasks thousands of times per shift. The Ford plant in Detroit also produced Jeeps using Ford's famous assembly line techniques. Ford's experience with mass production dating back to the Model T meant they could manufacture Jeeps efficiently despite not having designed the vehicle. Ford's GPW Jeeps were virtually identical to Willys MBs, though vehicle identification experts can spot subtle differences in manufacturing details. Component suppliers across the United States fed the Jeep production lines. Engines came from dedicated engine plants, transmissions came from transmission manufacturers. Axles, springs, wheels, tires, and hundreds of other components all came from specialized suppliers. The coordination required to keep components flowing to the assembly plants in the correct quantities and timing was an achievement, comparable to the manufacturing itself. Quality control was maintained despite the production pace. Each Jeep coming off the assembly line underwent basic testing before being shipped. The testing wasn't exhaustive, there wasn't time for that, but it caught major defects. Engines were run to verify they operated. Transmissions were shifted through all gears. Brakes were tested. Lights were checked. The testing was basic but sufficient to ensure vehicles reached military users in functional condition. The standardization of parts across Willys and Ford production meant that components were interchangeable. A transmission from a Willys MB could be installed in a Ford GPW. An axle from a Ford could replace a broken axle in a Willys. This interchangeability enormously simplified logistics and maintenance. Spare parts didn't have to be matched to specific manufacturers. Any Jeep part would fit any Jeep. The packaging for shipping was carefully designed. Jeeps were sometimes shipped fully assembled, but more often they were partially disassembled to save space. The disassembly was minimal, usually just removing the windshield and possibly the hood, but it allowed more Jeeps to fit on ships. The vehicles could be reassembled quickly at their destination with basic tools. The shipping volume was enormous. Jeeps went to every theater of war: Europe, the Pacific, North Africa, the Middle East, China, Burma, India, and Alaska. They were shipped on cargo vessels, loaded onto aircraft carriers, carried in gliders, even parachuted from aircraft. The Jeep's lightweight and compact size made it relatively easy to transport compared to larger vehicles. The cost was approximately $750 per Jeep in $1,944, equivalent to about $12,000 in modern currency. This was extraordinarily economical for a vehicle with four-wheel drive and the Jeep's capabilities. The low cost reflected both efficient manufacturing and the vehicle's simplicity. There simply weren't many expensive components. The production workers took pride in building Jeeps. They knew the vehicles were going to soldiers who would depend on them in combat. Quality became a patriotic duty, not just a job requirement. Workers voluntarily stayed late to fix defects. Suggestions for improvements were actively solicited and implemented when practical. The production workforce felt personally invested in the success of the vehicles they built. The supply chain management required to sustain production was sophisticated. Steel had to arrive continuously. Any disruption would halt production. Rubber for tires was in short supply after Japanese conquest of Southeast Asian rubber plantations, requiring rationing and substitution. Petroleum-based products like paints and solvents competed with other military needs. The logistics of keeping production running were as complex as the manufacturing itself. The Jeep's versatility became legendary. Soldiers found thousands of uses for the vehicle, most never imagined by its designers. The Jeep became the Swiss Army knife of military vehicles, not the best at any single task, but capable of doing almost anything adequately. Reconnaissance was the original mission, and jeeps excelled at it. They could move quickly on roads, then go cross-country to investigate terrain or locate enemy positions. The low profile made them relatively inconspicuous. The speed allowed them to break contact if they encountered superior forces. Reconnaissance units learned to use jeeps aggressively, probing enemy positions and reporting back with intelligence that informed tactical decisions. Communication duties kept jeeps constantly moving. Officers used them to travel between units, maintaining coordination that radio couldn't always provide. Jeeps carried messages when radio silence was required. They transported liaison officers to coordinate between different military branches. The mobility the jeep provided was essential to command and control in mobile warfare. Medical evacuation became one of the jeep's most important roles. Stretchers could be mounted on the hood and sides, allowing a single jeep to evacuate 4 wounded men. The jeep's speed meant wounded soldiers reached medical care faster than horse-drawn or hand-carried litters could manage. Thousands of wounded men owed their lives to jeep ambulances that got them to aid stations before they bled out. Artillery forward observers used jeeps to position themselves where they could see targets and coordinate fire missions. The jeep's mobility allowed observers to move rapidly as tactical situations changed. Radios mounted in jeeps maintained communication with artillery batteries. The ability to quickly reposition forward observers while maintaining communications made artillery more responsive and accurate. Ammunition resupply was constant work for jeeps. Infantry units in combat consumed ammunition at high rates. Jeeps could carry several hundred pounds of ammunition and navigate to forward positions that larger trucks couldn't reach. The continuous flow of ammunition that jeeps provided kept infantry units in action during sustained combat. Wire laying was essential for field telephone communications. Jeeps mounted with spools of wire drove routes while paying out wire behind them, establishing telephone lines rapidly. The wire could be damaged by artillery or vehicles, requiring constant repair. Jeeps carried repair crews that could splice damaged lines and restore communications. Towing duties ranged from anti-tank guns to damaged vehicles to artillery pieces. The jeep's quarter-ton rating was regularly exceeded. It could tow loads of 2 tons or more when necessary, though this stressed the drivetrain. Anti-tank gun crews particularly appreciated jeeps because the combination of jeep and gun could reposition rapidly after engaging targets. Command vehicles were often jeeps with radios and map boards installed. Commanders could position themselves where they needed to be, maintaining communication with higher headquarters and subordinate units. The visibility from a jeep was better than from inside a tank or armored vehicle, allowing commanders to better assess tactical situations. Supply transport consumed enormous numbers of jeeps. They hauled everything from rations to fuel to spare parts to personal mail. The jeep's ability to navigate poor roads and cross-country routes made it invaluable for supply units trying to reach forward units. Supply jeeps drove around the clock, maintaining the logistical flow that sustained combat operations. Military police used jeeps for traffic control, security patrols, and prisoner transport. The visibility and mobility allowed MP units to monitor large areas and respond quickly to incidents. Jeeps became associated with military authorities. Seeing MP jeeps was a reminder that military regulations were being enforced. Innovative weapons platforms emerged as soldiers experimented. Jeeps mounted with .50 caliber machine guns became light fighting vehicles. Some jeeps carried multiple machine guns, creating mobile firepower platforms. The Special Air Service in North Africa mounted multiple machine guns and even light cannons on jeeps, creating what amounted to light cavalry that could strike deep behind enemy lines. The bazooka-armed jeep became an improvised tank destroyer. A jeep crew with bazookas could fire from hidden positions, destroy or disable enemy armor, then escape before retaliation. The tactics were dangerous. Jeeps had no armor protection, but effective when executed properly. German tankers learned to be wary of jeeps lurking in ambush positions. Airborne operations used jeeps extensively. Jeeps could be loaded into gliders, providing airborne units with motorized transport immediately upon landing. Some jeeps were fitted with parachutes and dropped from aircraft, though this often damaged them. The ability to deliver motorized transport to airborne forces dramatically increased their combat power and mobility. Beach operations saw jeeps employed in ways never intended. Waterproof jeeps waded ashore during amphibious landings, often in water deep enough that engines barely kept running. Once on beaches, they hauled supplies from landing craft, evacuated wounded, and kept communication going while larger vehicles struggled with sand and obstacles. Civilian rescue operations employed jeeps in liberated areas. Jeeps evacuated civilians caught in combat zones. They delivered food and medical supplies to refugee populations. They transported civil affairs officers coordinating occupation and reconstruction. The jeep became symbol of American presence and assistance in areas devastated by war. The jeep proved particularly valuable in the Pacific, where terrain and climate created challenges that tested vehicles to their limits. Jungles, mountains, coral islands, and tropical conditions all stressed equipment in ways that European warfare didn't. The jungle terrain of New Guinea, Burma, and the Philippines was particularly difficult. Roads were primitive or non-existent. Mud could be axle-deep. Vegetation was so dense that jeeps sometimes had to bulldoze through it. The humidity and heat created maintenance challenges. Yet jeeps kept running, providing mobility in conditions where movement seemed impossible. The island-hopping campaign used jeeps extensively. Each captured island required the same pattern: land jeeps in amphibious assaults. Use them to support combat operations during the battle for the island. Then establish them as part of the garrison and support infrastructure once the island was secured. Jeeps were among the first vehicles ashore and among the last to leave when bases were eventually abandoned. The coral terrain common to Pacific islands was murder on tires. Sharp coral fragments punctured tires constantly. Units went through tires at rates far exceeding European experience. Tire maintenance and repair consumed enormous effort. Some jeeps operated with solid rubber tires or even steel wheels when pneumatic tires couldn't be kept inflated. The salt water exposure from amphibious landings and constant ocean spray created corrosion problems that European-based jeeps rarely faced. Metal components rusted rapidly. Electrical systems failed. Paint peeled away in weeks. Maintenance in the Pacific meant constant battle against corrosion, using whatever preservatives and protective coatings were available. The distances in the Pacific meant that jeeps often operated far from supply points. Fuel and parts had to be brought in by ship, and sometimes weren't available when needed. Units learned to cannibalize damaged jeeps to keep others running. The mechanical simplicity that allowed this field-expedient maintenance was crucial to maintaining operational vehicles. MacArthur's advance through the Philippines employed jeeps as key elements of reconnaissance and mobile operations. The jeeps ranged ahead of main forces, identifying enemy positions and routes of advance. Filipino guerrillas received jeeps that dramatically enhanced their effectiveness against Japanese forces. The mobility the jeep provided was force multiplier in terrain where movement was otherwise extremely difficult. The Burma campaign saw jeeps operating in some of the war's worst terrain. The Burma Road crossed mountains through areas where roads were often just trails. Merrill's marauders used jeeps when terrain permitted, though much of their advance was on foot through jungle where no vehicles could operate. When jeeps could be used, they provided capability that was otherwise absent. The China-Burma-India theater relied heavily on jeeps for the supply operations that kept Chinese forces equipped. Jeeps drove the Burma Road and other supply routes, delivering materials that had been flown over the Himalayas. The jeep's reliability in difficult conditions made it ideal for supply operations where vehicle breakdowns could strand convoys hundreds of miles from support. The atomic missions from Tinian employed jeeps throughout the island's operations. The B-29 bases required constant supply and maintenance support. Jeeps moved personnel, parts, and supplies around the sprawling base complex. The Enola Gay crew rode to their aircraft in a jeep on the morning of August 6, 1945, a prosaic detail that illustrates how integrated jeeps had become in every aspect of military operations. In Europe, the jeep proved equally valuable, though in different ways than the Pacific. The road networks were better, but combat was often more intense. The distances were shorter, but the operational tempo was higher. Armored warfare dominated in ways it didn't in the Pacific, creating both opportunities and dangers for jeep operations. The D-Day landings brought hundreds of jeeps ashore in the initial assault. Waterproof jeeps drove through surf to reach the beaches, though many drowned out when seawater overwhelmed the waterproofing. Once on the beaches, jeeps immediately began supporting operations, evacuating wounded from the bluffs above Omaha Beach, moving ammunition to units engaged with German defenders, providing transportation for commanders coordinating the chaotic situation. The breakout from Normandy saw jeeps employed in fast-moving operations that exploited German collapse. Armored columns racing across France needed reconnaissance ahead of the tanks. Jeeps ranged forward, identifying enemy positions and possible ambushes. The speed and mobility of jeep reconnaissance allowed armored columns to maintain pace that would have been impossible with slower, more cautious advance. Patton's Third Army was particularly aggressive in using jeeps for reconnaissance and exploitation. Patton himself famously preferred riding in jeeps rather than command vehicles because the jeep's visibility let him see tactical situations better. His units raced across France, often operating far ahead of supply lines, with jeeps providing the mobility that characterized Third Army operations. The hedgerow fighting in Normandy challenged jeeps differently than open terrain. The Norman bocage consisted of small fields surrounded by thick hedgerows that blocked movement and visibility. Jeeps could navigate the narrow lanes between hedgerows but were vulnerable to ambush. Crews learned to reconnaissance carefully, using infantry support when possible, and being ready to reverse rapidly when encountering opposition. The Ardennes Offensive in December 1944 saw jeeps employed in desperate defensive operations. When German forces broke through American lines, jeeps evacuated headquarters, moved reinforcements, and maintained communications as units fell back, and attempted to establish new defensive positions. Some jeeps were captured by Germans, who prized them for their reliability and mobility. The German use of captured jeeps created security problems. During the Bulge, English-speaking German commandos operated behind American lines and captured jeeps and American uniforms. The operation created paranoia about jeep identification. Guards stopped jeeps to verify that occupants were actually American. The incident demonstrated how valuable jeeps were that Germans would conduct special operations specifically to capture them. The Rhine crossing operations employed jeeps in assault river crossings. Jeeps were among the first vehicles across pontoon bridges and ferries, establishing presence on the far bank and supporting units expanding the bridgehead. The mobility jeeps provided was crucial during the vulnerable period when forces on the far bank were still building up strength. The race across Germany in the war's final months saw jeeps operating at the forefront of the advance. Units covered hundreds of miles, liberating concentration camps, accepting surrenders of German units, and ranging ahead to link up with Soviet forces advancing from the east. Jeeps provided the reconnaissance and mobility that allowed this rapid advance despite German attempts to establish defensive positions. The liberation of Paris included jeeps among the first Allied vehicles to enter the city. The images of jeeps driving through crowds of celebrating Parisians became iconic photographs of the liberation. The jeep had become a symbol of American military power and the liberation it brought to occupied Europe. The jeep's reputation for reliability was earned through robust design and maintainability, but even jeeps required constant maintenance to stay operational. The difference was that jeep maintenance could be performed by soldiers with basic mechanical knowledge using simple tools under field conditions. The maintenance manual for the jeep was written in plain English with clear illustrations. It assumed soldiers had basic mechanical aptitude, but didn't require specialized training. Procedures were broken down into simple steps. Troubleshooting guides helped diagnose problems. The manual became famous for its clarity and usability. Preventive maintenance was emphasized. Regular oil changes, lubrication of fittings, checking fluid levels, inspecting belts and hoses. These basic procedures prevented many failures. Units that maintained jeeps properly had far fewer breakdowns than those that neglected maintenance. The simplicity of the maintenance procedures meant there was no excuse for not performing them. The common failures were predictable and usually easily repaired. Fan belts broke, but replacing them required only basic tools and a few minutes. Spark plugs fouled, but cleaning or replacing them was straightforward. Fuel pumps failed, but rebuilding them in the field was possible with the rebuild kits included in parts inventories. The failures were normal wear items, not mysterious mechanical problems. The availability of spare parts varied by location and date, but part supply was generally adequate. The standardization across hundreds of thousands of jeeps meant that parts production was economical. Common wear items like spark plugs, filters, and fan belts were stocked in large quantities. Major components like engines and transmissions were available, though sometimes required waiting for supply convoys. The field repair capabilities soldiers developed were impressive. Engines were swapped in the field, often in less than a day. Transmissions were rebuilt using parts cannibalized from damaged Jeeps. Axles were replaced. Body damage was patched. The mechanical simplicity meant that repairs didn't require specialized tools or facilities. A mechanically inclined soldier with a toolkit could perform repairs that would require a full shop for more complex vehicles. The cannibalization of damaged Jeeps was accepted practice. When a Jeep was damaged beyond practical repair, it became a part source. Usable components were stripped and used to repair other Jeeps. This field expedient kept more Jeeps running than strict adherence to official repair procedures would have allowed. Units became expert at keeping Jeeps operational through creative parts, swapping, and improvisation. The environmental challenges required adaptations. In North Africa, sand filters were added to prevent dust from destroying engines. In Europe, cold weather kits included engine heaters and winterized lubricants. In the Pacific, corrosion prevention became constant battle. The adaptations were usually simple modifications that could be made in the field rather than requiring factory modifications. The driver maintenance that Jeep drivers performed prevented many failures. Checking oil levels daily, inspecting tires, listening for unusual noises, watching gauges. Attentive drivers caught problems early before they became failures. The instrumentation was simple enough that abnormal readings were obvious. Drivers developed intimate knowledge of their vehicles and could detect problems by sound or feel before gauges showed issues. The motor pool maintenance performed by unit mechanics provided next level of support beyond driver maintenance. Motor pools had better tools, more skilled mechanics, and part stocks. They performed repairs beyond driver capability and conducted scheduled maintenance at prescribed intervals. The motor pool maintenance kept Jeeps operational between major overhauls. The depot-level maintenance provided complete rebuilding of worn Jeeps. Vehicles were stripped down, components rebuilt or replaced, and the Jeeps returned to service essentially as new. Depot maintenance required facilities and equipment not available in the field, but it extended vehicle service life enormously. Many Jeeps were rebuilt multiple times during the war. The Jeep became more than just a military vehicle. It became cultural icon, symbol of American capability, and beloved artifact that transcended its utilitarian purpose. The cultural impact began during the war and continues today. Soldiers developed affection for their Jeeps that went beyond normal appreciation for equipment. Jeeps were personalized with names, painted decorations, and unofficial modifications. Some Jeeps had their own histories and reputations within units. The affection was genuine. Soldiers trusted their lives to Jeeps, and those Jeeps rarely let them down. The civilians in liberated areas saw Jeeps as symbols of American presence and power. Children learned to recognize Jeeps and would run after them begging for chocolate or chewing gum. The Jeep became associated with liberation, freedom, and American generosity. Photographs of Jeeps driving through liberated towns and cities captured moments of joy and relief. The war correspondents and photographers used Jeeps constantly, making the vehicles ubiquitous in wartime reporting. Ernie Pyle rode in Jeeps while reporting from the front lines. Robert Capa photographed Jeeps during the D-Day landings and throughout the European campaign. The Jeep appeared in countless photographs and film footage, making it one of the most visually documented vehicles of the war. The Hollywood portrayal of the Jeep began during the war and continued for decades afterward. War movies invariably featured Jeeps because they were essential to portraying military operations accurately. The Jeep became visual shorthand for American military presence. Directors used Jeeps to establish military contexts without needing exposition. The political symbolism of the Jeep emerged as well. Leaders from Roosevelt to Eisenhower were photographed in Jeeps, using them to visit troops and project image of hands-on leadership. Churchill rode in a Jeep during his visits to military units. De Gaulle entered Paris in a Jeep. The Jeep became vehicle of choice for leaders wanting to associate themselves with military forces and project martial image. The post-war civilian market for Jeeps was immediate and enormous. Soldiers who had driven Jeeps wanted them for civilian use. Farmers recognized the utility for agricultural work. Hunters and outdoorsmen wanted vehicles that could go anywhere. Willys began civilian production almost immediately after the war ended, and demand far exceeded supply for years. The Jeep's design influenced post-war vehicle development. The concept of light four-wheel drive utility vehicle became established product category. Other manufacturers developed competing designs, but the Jeep remained the standard against which others were measured. The genes of the World War II Jeep are visible in modern SUVs and light trucks. The collector and restoration community that emerged decades after the war keeps World War II Jeeps alive. Thousands of preserved and restored Jeeps exist, maintained by enthusiasts who appreciate the vehicle's history and simplicity. Military vehicle shows and events regularly feature Jeeps. The vehicles that were built as utilitarian tools have become treasured artifacts. The Jeep brand itself became valuable intellectual property. Willys trademarked the name post-war, and it eventually passed to Chrysler. The brand carries associations of capability, reliability, and adventure that trace directly back to World War II. Modern Jeeps bear little mechanical relationship to the original, but the brand identity remains tied to the World War II vehicle's reputation. The production statistics tell the story of the Jeep's importance. Total production of approximately 640,000 units during World War II represented one Jeep for every 25 American service members. No other vehicle approached this density of distribution. The Jeep's ubiquity reflected its versatility and importance. Willys produced approximately 363,000 MBS. Ford produced approximately 280,000 GPWs. American Bantam's production was limited to about 2,700 vehicles because their small production capacity made them impractical for wartime production volumes. The split between Willys and Ford ensured adequate production while maintaining standardization. The cost of $750 per Jeep in $1,944 meant the total program cost approached $480 million, equivalent to roughly $7 billion in modern currency. This represented one of the most cost-effective equipment programs of the war. The capability-to-cost ratio was extraordinarily favorable. Few weapon systems provided as much utility for the investment. The fuel consumption of approximately 15 miles per gallon seems inefficient by modern standards but was acceptable for 1940s technology. A Jeep consumed about 6 to 7 gallons per 100 miles. Which over 640,000 Jeeps operating thousands of miles consumed enormous volumes of fuel. Yet the fuel consumption was far less than larger trucks or armored vehicles, making Jeeps relatively efficient in the context of military operations. The maintenance hours required per vehicle were surprisingly low compared to more complex vehicles. A well-maintained Jeep might need 2 to 3 hours of maintenance per 100 miles of operation, compared to 10 or more hours for tanks or heavy trucks. The low maintenance requirements meant Jeeps consumed less mechanic time per mile of service, freeing maintenance personnel for other duties. The casualty rates among Jeep crews are difficult to quantify precisely because Jeeps were used in such varied roles. Reconnaissance Jeep crews faced high casualty rates because they operated close to enemy positions. Medical evacuation Jeep drivers faced dangers from operating in combat zones. Supply drivers were vulnerable to ambush. Yet overall, Jeep operations probably had lower casualty rates than infantry or armor because of the vehicle's mobility and the varied non-combat roles many Jeeps served. The Jeeps provided to Allied nations under Lend-Lease numbered in the tens of thousands. Britain received approximately 30,000 Jeeps. The Soviet Union received over 50,000. France, China, and other allies received significant numbers as well. The Jeep became standard equipment in Allied armies worldwide, a testament to its recognized value. The post-war disposal of military Jeeps created a secondary market that lasted decades. Thousands of surplus Jeeps were sold to civilians at prices that made them accessible to average buyers. Many of these surplus Jeeps continued operating for decades, testament to their durability and repairability. Some World War II Jeeps remained in daily use into the 1970s and beyond. The survival rate of World War II Jeeps is remarkably high compared to most military equipment. While exact numbers are difficult to determine, thousands of original World War II Jeeps survive today in various conditions from derelict hulks to fully restored examples. The survival rate reflects both the vehicle's durability and the affection owners develop for them. The Soviet Union received over 50,000 Jeeps through Lend-Lease, and Soviet experiences with them provide interesting perspective on the vehicle's universal appeal. Soviet forces accustomed to their own vehicles quickly adopted Jeeps for reconnaissance, command, and liaison duties. Soviet officers particularly appreciated Jeeps for their reliability compared to Soviet light vehicles. The GAZ-64 and later GAZ-67 were Soviet attempts to create indigenous equivalents. But they never achieved the Jeep's reputation for reliability. Soviet commanders often preferred American Jeeps to Soviet vehicles when they had choice. The Red Army employed Jeeps in the massive operations that drove German forces from Soviet territory and eventually to Berlin. Jeeps provided mobility for reconnaissance units ranging ahead of Soviet armor. They served as command vehicles for officers coordinating the enormous armies engaged in the Eastern Front campaigns. They evacuated wounded from battlefields where Soviet medical transport was inadequate. Soviet modifications to Jeeps reflected their operational priorities. Some were fitted with heavier weapons than Americans typically mounted. Others received additional armor protection, though this defeated the Jeep's lightweight advantage. Soviet mechanics maintained Jeeps using whatever parts and materials were available, demonstrating the vehicle's adaptability to different maintenance doctrines. The post-war Soviet assessment of Lend-Lease aid acknowledged that Jeeps had been among the most useful items received. Soviet generals writing memoirs decades later mentioned Jeeps favorably. Unusual recognition given Cold War tendencies to minimize Western contributions to Soviet victory. The Jeep had impressed even the notoriously difficult-to-impress Red Army. The Jeep became legendary in special operations, particularly with British and American special forces operating behind enemy lines. The mobility and firepower of armed Jeeps made them ideal for raids deep into enemy territory. The British Special Air Service SAS, in North Africa, transformed Jeeps into formidable raiding vehicles. They mounted multiple .50 caliber machine guns and sometimes .303 Vickers K guns, creating mobile gun platforms that could engage targets while moving at high speed. The firepower concentrated on these Jeeps exceeded that of much larger vehicles. The SAS tactics involved long-range desert penetrations, sometimes hundreds of miles behind German lines. Jeeps loaded with fuel, water, and ammunition would drive across the desert, navigating by sun compass and dead reckoning. Once in German rear areas, they would attack airfields, supply dumps, and communications facilities before escaping back into the desert. The most famous SAS Jeep operations targeted Axis airfields. Teams would drive onto airfields at night or dawn, strafe parked aircraft with concentrated machine gun fire, then escape before defenders could respond effectively. A single Jeep team might destroy dozens of aircraft in minutes. The psychological impact exceeded the physical damage as German and Italian forces had to divert resources to defend facilities they thought were secure. David Sterling, founder of the SAS, considered Jeeps essential to his unit's operations. The mobility allowed his small teams to strike across vast areas, forcing Axis forces to defend everywhere. The Jeep's reliability meant teams could operate far from support without worrying about breakdowns. The simplicity meant that repairs could be made in the field with minimal tools. American Special Operations units adopted similar tactics. The Office of Strategic Services used Jeeps for operations in occupied Europe and Asia. Jeeps could be infiltrated through enemy lines, providing mobility for teams conducting sabotage, organizing resistance, or gathering intelligence. The Jeep became tool of choice for irregular warfare. The Jedburgh teams that operated in France supporting resistance movements relied heavily on Jeeps. The teams parachuted into France, made contact with resistance groups, and coordinated attacks on German forces. Jeeps delivered by parachute or captured from German forces provided the mobility these teams needed to operate effectively across large areas. The Philippine guerrillas received Jeeps that transformed their effectiveness against Japanese occupation forces. The mobility allowed guerrilla units to concentrate for attacks, then disperse before Japanese forces could respond. Jeeps evacuated wounded guerrillas to medical facilities hidden in remote areas. They transported supplies and ammunition to units throughout the islands. Maro's marauders in Burma used Jeeps when terrain permitted. While much of their operations were on foot through jungle where no vehicles could operate, when Jeeps could be employed, they provided capability that multiplied the unit's effectiveness. Supply Jeeps brought ammunition and evacuated wounded over trails that barely qualified as roads. The Jeep's place in popular memory of World War II is secure. It appears in countless memoirs, histories, photographs, and films. Veteran stories invariably include Jeeps, whether as background details or as central elements of particular incidents. The Jeep became one of the war's most recognizable symbols. Bill Mauldin's cartoons featuring Willie and Joe, the archetypal infantrymen, frequently included Jeeps. The vehicles appeared in the backgrounds, were subjects of jokes, and served as props for Maldon's commentary on military life. The cartoons captured the soldiers' affection for jeeps while acknowledging their limitations and quirks. Ernie Pyle's war correspondence mentioned jeeps constantly. Pyle rode in jeeps while traveling with combat units, slept in them when no other shelter was available, and used them to reach the frontline positions he wrote about. His descriptions of jeep travel captured both the discomfort and the utility. The jeep was a tool that enabled his journalism. The photographs of World War II invariably include jeeps, whether background details in combat photographs or subjects of images showing military life. Jeeps appear throughout the visual record. The ubiquity reflects how integrated jeeps had become in military operations. Any photograph of military activity likely included jeeps simply because they were everywhere. The post-war Hollywood war films featured jeeps prominently because they were essential to authentic portrayal of military operations. Films from the 1940s through the 1960s included jeeps because audiences expected to see them. Directors used jeeps to establish military settings economically. A few jeeps immediately communicated military context without extensive exposition. The veteran organizations that formed after the war maintained connections among those who had served together. Reunions often featured jeeps, either original military vehicles or civilian versions that evoked the wartime experience. The jeeps served as tangible links to shared experiences, physical manifestations of memories that veterans treasured. The children who came of age during and after World War II grew up seeing jeeps as symbols of American military power and the successful outcome of the war. Toy jeeps became popular, allowing children to play at war in ways that processed the massive conflict their parents had fought. The jeep became one of the standard toys of the post-war generation. The museums that preserve World War II history invariably include jeeps in their collections. The National World War II Museum, military base museums, and countless local historical societies display jeeps as representative artifacts of American military capability. The jeeps serve educational purposes, helping new generations understand the war their grandparents and great-grandparents fought. The jeep's engineering legacy extends beyond its direct military applications. The design philosophy it embodied, prioritizing simplicity, reliability, and maintainability over sophistication, influenced product design across industries. The automotive industry learned lessons from the jeep about designing for reliability under harsh conditions. The emphasis on mechanical simplicity that allowed field maintenance influenced post-war vehicle design. The recognition that adequate performance combined with high reliability often beats superior performance combined with unreliability shaped design priorities. The concept of the utility vehicle as distinct product category traces directly to the Jeep. The post-war market for light four-wheel drive vehicles that the Jeep created expanded enormously over subsequent decades. The SUV market that eventually developed into one of the automotive industry's largest segments has genetic connection to the World War II Jeep. The military vehicle design priorities established by the Jeep program influenced subsequent military vehicle development. The emphasis on transportability, maintainability, and versatility became standard requirements. The recognition that extreme specialization often reduces overall utility-shaped procurement decisions for decades. The manufacturing techniques refined during Jeep production influenced automotive manufacturing broadly. The scale of production required innovations in assembly line processes, quality control, and supply chain management. The lessons learned building hundreds of thousands of Jeeps informed post-war civilian vehicle production. The parts standardization and interchangeability that characterized Jeep production became models for other programs. The ability to manufacture vehicles in multiple facilities to identical specifications required manufacturing discipline that set standards for the industry. The demonstration that complete interchangeability was achievable at scale influenced manufacturing across sectors. Behind all the statistics, technical descriptions, and historical analysis were the individual soldiers whose lives were affected by Jeeps. Their stories, preserved in memoirs, letters, and oral histories, reveal the human dimension of the Jeep service. The drivers who operated Jeeps day after day developed intimate knowledge of their vehicles. They knew the quirks, the sounds that indicated problems, the handling characteristics. Many drivers named their Jeeps and talked about them as though they were sentient. The bonds between drivers and vehicles reflected the dependence soldiers felt on equipment that literally carried their lives. The mechanics who maintained Jeeps took pride in keeping them operational. A mechanic whose Jeeps rarely broke down earned respect from the units he supported. The ability to diagnose problems by sound, to repair vehicles with improvised parts, to keep equipment running despite supply shortages, these skills were valued and earned recognition. The wounded soldiers who owed their lives to Jeep ambulances never forgot the vehicles that evacuated them from battlefields. The speed and mobility that got them to medical care before they bled out made the difference between life and death. Some veterans maintained connections with the medical units that saved them, and the Jeeps were part of those memories. The officers who used Jeeps as command vehicles appreciated the visibility and mobility they provided. Being able to move quickly around battlefields, to see situations firsthand rather than relying on second-hand reports, to be visible to troops, these capabilities enhanced leadership effectiveness in ways that radio communication from distant headquarters couldn't match. The reconnaissance crews who drove Jeeps into danger zones developed different relationships with their vehicles. The Jeep's speed and agility could mean the difference between escaping an ambush and being overrun. Crews learned to trust their Jeeps to get them out of situations they shouldn't have gotten into. That trust was earned through experiences where the Jeep's performance saved lives. The supply drivers who drove Jeeps on long, dangerous hauls delivering ammunition and supplies had their own perspectives. The reliability that allowed them to complete missions despite mechanical stress, poor roads, and inadequate maintenance was crucial. A breakdown in dangerous territory could be fatal. The Jeep's reputation for keeping running despite abuse was well earned by these drivers' experiences. The Jeep's evolution from impossibly demanding specification to most versatile weapon of World War II reflects American industrial capacity, engineering ingenuity, and the soldiers' ability to adapt equipment to purposes never imagined by designers. The quarter-ton reconnaissance vehicle became jack-of-all-trades that served in virtually every role military operations required. The simplicity that made the Jeep maintainable by soldiers with basic tools also made it reliable under conditions that destroyed more sophisticated equipment. The versatility that allowed it to perform thousands of different missions made it indispensable despite limitations in any single role. The lightweight that made it transportable also made it maneuverable. Every design compromise that seemed like limitation proved to be strength. The cultural impact exceeded any purely military assessment. The Jeep became symbol of American capability, of liberation, of victory. It appeared in the photographs and film footage that documented the war. It featured in the stories veterans told their families. It became artifact that connected subsequent generations to the war their ancestors fought. The 640,000 Jeeps produced during World War II represented more than just vehicles. They represented a philosophy of equipment design that prioritized utility over elegance, reliability over sophistication, adaptability over specialization. That philosophy proved decisive in a war that rewarded forces that could adapt to changing circumstances and maintain operations, despite logistical challenges. For the G's who fought World War II, the Jeep was lifeline that connected them to supplies, to medical care, to communications, to mobility. It was tool that made impossible missions possible and difficult missions merely hard. It was machine they trusted with their lives and that rarely betrayed that trust. The affection veterans felt for Jeeps was genuine, earned through shared hardships and mutual dependence. The Jeep that emerged from mud, sand, jungles, and battlefields wasn't the vehicle designers had intended. It was something better, a platform that soldiers adapted to their needs, that mechanics kept running through ingenuity and determination, that proved more valuable than any specification could have predicted. The story of the Jeep becoming the war's most versatile weapon is ultimately a story about what happens when good design meets determined users and unlimited necessity. The World War II Jeep remains icon because it embodied qualities Americans like to associate with themselves: practical, reliable, unpretentious, capable, and resilient. Whether that self-image is accurate is debatable. That the Jeep possessed those qualities is historical fact. The little quarter-ton vehicle that was never supposed to be more than reconnaissance transport became symbol of American military power and enduring reminder of what simple, well-executed design can accomplish when it meets genuine need.